Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Eleanor Goldfield, along with Mickey Huff. We're very glad right now to be joined by Andrew Crespo, who is a professor of law at Harvard University, where he has taught criminal law and procedure for the past decade. He's also the executive director of the Institute to End Mass Incarceration. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here with you.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start actually with the theme or the concept of a book of yours that came out earlier this year titled Criminal Law in the American Penal System, that outlines how the U.S. legal system and its lawyers have promoted and upheld an increasingly oppressive penal system reliant on mass incarceration. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about this and how the current framing of criminal law courses really serves the carceral system, a bit like how Richard Wolff points out that economics classes produced capitalists without ever suggesting that there are, in fact, other ways to build economies.
It's a great question. Thanks for asking it. Yeah, this is an insight that a number of folks who teach criminal law, I think, have felt in their bones for a long time. It was put really powerfully by a friend and colleague at another institution named Alice Ristroff, who has an article called The Curriculum of the Carceral State, which just really, I think, has rung true for me for a lot of my career and was the motivation behind writing this book. As many of your listeners will probably know, the United States incarcerates more of its own people than any country in the history of the planet. And law and lawyers were a central part of that. Part of the reason why we have so many people in prison is that we have longer sentences and a more expansive and oppressive criminal code than is true of a lot of other jurisdictions. My own scholarship has focused a lot on how this impacts something that's called plea bargaining, which again, something probably your listeners know a lot about. But anyone who's grown up in the United States and has a sense of our criminal justice system from, say, watching TV, whether that's, real crime shows or whether it's, pick your, procedural drama, probably has this image that like people who get arrested are brought into a courtroom, they have a trial, their defendant makes the defense lawyer makes a speech to a jury, and then if they get convicted, they get sent to prison. Which is not at all how our system works, right? Close to 95% of people who are in prison are there because they pled guilty. And they pled guilty because a prosecutor called their lawyer and said, look, I'm going to threaten your client with a massive amount of time in prison, but if they agree to waive all of their constitutional rights, not have a trial, not have a jury of their peers, not put on any evidence, then I will offer a fraction, a sliver of that prison exposure. And for the vast majority of people, as that leverage gets bigger. If someone is offering you 2 years in prison if you plead guilty, but saying if you pass on the deal, they're going to threaten you with a mandatory life sentence, the rational thing to do for the vast majority of people is to plead guilty, whether they are guilty to what they're accused of or not. Basically, plea bargaining makes incarceration massively cheap for prosecutors. Prosecutors can do in minutes what would otherwise take them weeks. I saw this firsthand when I was a public defender. I would sit in court every day, and the judge's calendar would be structured for trial time from, say, 10:30 a.m. until 4:30 when the courtroom would close. And a trial could last multiple days. You'd be in there 10:30 to 4:30 for days and days and days to get one trial through. But from 9 a.m. till 10:30 every morning was basically plea bargain time. And you would see 60, 70, 80 people pleading guilty and have convictions, produced in that morning hour, compared to the week it would take for the rest of for the small number of cases going to trial. This is a product of law. If you pass a lot of criminal codes, and if you have really long sentences, and if you give prosecutors unchecked discretion to charge high and plead low, you're going to get really, really cheap convictions, which means you're going to get a ton of them. And that basic dynamic has not been centered in American criminal law courses for the past, half century. American criminal law courses have taught sort of legal doctrine as if trials were all happening in the shadow of the cases that go to trial. If you look at criminal law courses, they're mostly teaching people based on cases that are appeals of cases that go to trial. I open my class and tell my students, look, those cases represent the tiniest fraction of an unrepresentative part of the system, the cases that went to trial and made it up to appeal. What you need to understand is how the law in those cases has built a structure and system of discretionary power for prosecutors that allows them to control the outcomes of cases through plea bargaining, and that plea bargaining has been a major driver of a prison system that is so incredibly large.
And I'm curious, I mean, I want to get your thoughts about, reform, or I don't even really like that word, but suggestions on how to make things less unjust. But in your opinion, would something as simple as like, hey, prosecutors, you can't actually aim high anymore. You can't just say, I'm going to threaten you with life in prison. Here are more narrow parameters for you to work within. Would something like that fix it? Or is this kind of like a ripple effect where prosecutors are just this one piece in a larger machine, and editing their parameters won't really fix anything?
Yeah, I think my answer is sort of both almost, right? Like your starting point for that question, I think is absolutely right. I think of mass incarceration as a sort of phrase I use to describe a broad system of penal control in our society. And it has long legacies. It has legacies tied to prior systems of racial oppression, including slavery and Jim Crow. It's deeply intertwined with our economic system. We basically use our prisons as sponges for people in poverty. The vast majority of people in prison are too poor to afford a lawyer. We use prisons as the social welfare institution in our country. Instead of putting money at the front end into things that we know prevent crime, prevent harm in communities like public schooling, public health, good housing, economic security, we massively underinvest in that as a society. We create conditions for a sort of permanent underclass, or people who are really struggling with precarity and economic hardship, which a century's worth of sociological literature tells us, among all the other harms that those types of, lack of material support and needs produces, it also produces criminal offending. Criminal offending is a product of social policy. And as a result, crime is concentrated in the same communities that have what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment, social policies that neglect them on housing, that neglect them on all these other important social supports, including education and public health. Our approach for a long time has been to put those public dollars on the back end into trying to just soak up people who engage in that type of harmful behavior into a prison system. And then on top of that, we criminalize broad swaths of sort of public order or public maintenance, kind of broken windows style offenses, as a way of trying to project sort of a sense of control onto those very same communities that are suffering from that organized abandonment. So it's a broad system, and fixing it requires engaging some of those root causes. At the same time, you have to try to basically do as much as you can in as many sites as you can all at once to try to address the massive scale and harms of it. So I do think, yes, that regulations of prosecutors' plea bargaining authority could be a meaningful constraint on their ability to send people to prison as quickly, as with as little friction and as little cost as they currently have in terms of just the resources. Another way to think about this is one way that you can try to regulate or reform a system is through resource constraints, right? Like if you make it harder to send someone to prison by making it more likely that prosecutors will do the costly thing that the Constitution requires, which is a public, speedy trial in front of a jury of your peers, that takes a lot more effort than standing in front of a judge for 15 minutes and saying, do you plead guilty? Yes, I plead guilty. So there's ways to try to think of law as a source of not just rights, but also speed bumps or valuable friction in a system that is running way too hot, in a system that is massively over-incarcerating because it's just spinning at, it's like turbocharged because of what plea bargaining allows it to do. So I think plea bargaining is meaningful, that if you found ways to constrain prosecutors' leverage, and there's all sorts of ways you could imagine sort of legal reforms doing that, or you could imagine also more direct actions, sort of collective action among criminal defendants that would make it harder for prosecutors to push them all through the system so quickly. Any of those things would slow down the machine of prosecution, which is in turn the machine of the entry point to prisons. But it's not going to solve the root causes. It's not going to solve the root problems, which are that we as a society put our money in the wrong place. We put too much of it in back-end, quote unquote, solutions like policing and incarceration, and nowhere near enough of it in front-end solutions that are more effective as crime deterrents. Even if all you care about is preventing crime, it's more effective to put that money into a public school, into better public hospitals, better mental health supports, better food and housing security.
And I mean, part of this problem, when you said slowing down the system, it reminded me of a conversation that I had in the LA court system with somebody that I was interviewing for a story, and they said the problem is that there's just there's way too many cases. There are cases that won't go to trial for, fill in the blank, the foreseeable future. So what do you, I mean, with this backlog, a lot of people say, well, the plea bargain is for, because we're never going to get to them anyway. They'll be rotting away because we also, of course, incarcerate people awaiting trial because you're certainly not innocent until proven guilty in that sense. So what do you do with this massive backlog of people that are waiting just to even say they would take a plea bargain? I mean, it just seems like that's also this inertia of this remarkable backlog that's also, of course, part of this system that overvalues arrests and overvalues throwing people into the system.
This is a question that I think, just like you, I've heard so many times. And I think it perfectly captures the sort of shift in mental framework that's necessary to really understand what it would look like to end mass incarceration, right? When I say end mass incarceration, I'm just talking about, again, the fact that our country is a massive international outlier, right? We incarcerate more of our own people on a per capita basis than any peer country. We don't even come close, right? Our per capita rates are like 5 to 7 times higher than places like Canada, the UK, Germany, right? Like these, like, other similarly, socioeconomic countries. In order to get somewhere close to our per capita incarceration rates, you have to look at countries like Russia. You have to look at countries like, Turkey. You have to look at countries that we often criticize as authoritarian regimes. What would it look like to not incarcerate our own people at that level? At some point, we have to incarcerate fewer people, right? There's just no way to go from being a world leader in incarcerating your own people to not being that without reducing your rate of incarceration. And I think people often, when I sort of talk to them in that way, say, yeah, of course, that makes sense. And then somehow when you talk to them about plea bargaining or think of like prison conditions, right? You talk to them and say like, look, we shouldn't be building new prisons at like we built all of these massive prisons during the 1980s. We basically built the physical infrastructure of mass incarceration. Those buildings are starting to crumble now. And all across the country, we're dealing with the first echo of the prison boom. And we're going to have to decide, are we going to start closing these buildings or not? Similar to plea bargaining, are we going to try to restrict plea bargaining or not? And every time you sort of put it that way, someone asks, like you did, but what about all the people with the backlog of cases who need plea bargains in order to get their case resolved quickly? Or what about all the people in prison who are in these crumbling prisons? Like, what are we going to do? Don't we need to build new prisons to have nicer facilities for them? And I think that question is natural, but also captures the sense in which we're caught in the mode of thinking that produced mass incarceration. Because there is an alternative to processing the backlog through plea bargainings, just like there's an alternative to building a huge new prison to have nicer walls for the people who are in there. You can deal with the backlog by dismissing a lot of the cases. You can deal with the overcrowded prison by letting some of the people who are inside of it out. And that sounds like, when people first hear that, sometimes they think like, oh, that sounds like a radical idea. You're going to dismiss cases or you're going to let people out of prison? And again, I need to come back to the basic point. If you are going to end mass incarceration, you have to incarcerate fewer people. So at some point, you have to dismiss some of the cases you otherwise would have brought or let some of the people who are currently incarcerated out. But here, I think, is the valuable way of talking to people about some of this too, which is when you start to actually understand the human beings who are implicated in this and not think of them as data points or as scary sort of, figures who are, far removed and easy to demonize, it starts to make a lot more sense thinking about letting folks out. When you start to learn that a huge number of people in prison are either middle-aged or old, and are past the point where there's any meaningful risk that they're going to actually cause any, like, that they're going to continue to engage in behavior that got them incarcerated in the first place. The idea that we are incarcerating people into their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, that we have growing geriatric wards in our prisons is just nuts, right? We should be letting people out. We should be trying to have fewer people go in the first place. And yes, that means that your backlog should shrink, not because you're plea bargaining, pleaing everybody through the plea bargaining mill, but because if you actually force prosecutors to have more friction, they will naturally have to triage their cases more. They'll have to focus on the cases that they think are actually most important. If you tell them, look, I'm sorry, you're only going to be able to prosecute a tenth of the cases that you were last week, that means that they're going to have to be more focused on where their actual priorities are, and that the people who shouldn't be caught up in this system in the first place are not going to be. And that the people who are still getting prosecuted, we have to find ways to actually, again, I come back to this, deal with these root causes and root problems. Because even for the people who are still getting sort of focused on by the prosecutors in that ideally more constrained system, are still people who are coming through that system because they're at the back end of having not lived in a society that invested in their public health, in their schools, in their housing, in their security early on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, comedian Lee Camp has a bit about how we could get rid of the prison system by just looking at why people are sent to prison, and the majority are quote unquote nonviolent crimes. And so really it wouldn't be that hard if you actually took the time and the energy to do it. And I kind of want to dig into that paradigm, or those paradigm shifts here, because um propaganda, you're the editor-in-chief and founding editor of Inquest, which is a media outlet known as Decarceral Brainstorm. And as is the case with many independent media outlets, y'all do the vital work of covering perspectives, voices, and frontline experiences that are purposely kept out of not just corporate media, but of media in general. And I'm including, of course, TV shows and the like. So these decarceral perspectives are never addressed or shared in legitimate ways, which leads to this kind of, fish in the water who doesn't know it's in the water paradigm, where everyone just kind of accepts the violence of the carceral system and of cops and those the kind of things without question. And could you talk a little bit about the importance not just of addressing like the legal structures and of course the physical structures, but also the paradigms and the kind of propaganda that people are brought up in from, I mean, I have a 3-year-old, and the amount of propaganda I'm like, swatting down in the midst of, stores and media is remarkable. Could you talk a little bit about that aspect of it?
I have a 5-year-old and feel like we could do like a multi-part podcast series just
Yes.
on the perils of Paw Patrol and the challenge of parenting in a Paw Patrol world. But I'm really appreciative to you for mentioning Inquest, which is a publication that our institute runs that our whole team is super proud of. Because our mission in founding was to do exactly what you're talking about, to have a magazine that would be offering a whole range of sort of perspectives and insights and ideas from folks who basically approach mass incarceration as a major problem and a major injustice, right? In other words, we didn't want to set out to have a magazine that was trying to like persuade people that this is a problem or that it's real, but rather we wanted to create a space for folks to start thinking about what solutions would look like, and also what it looks like to just have a magazine that, to use your phrase, is just soaking in a different set of water, right? That is not moving in the space that we all grew up in, which is, again, these, TV show procedurals, or, even just the nightly news, right? And I want to name a central feature of that more conventional water, to your point. It ties back to your question about the book that my co-author and I wrote for first year law students. Among the biggest problems in how we typically talk about crime in the United States is that we just treat we treat every instance of criminal misbehavior or harm as an individual failing, right? We moralize, and we have a whole, almost, by the time you're 5, by the time you're 4, already a set of like mental heuristics and frameworks that we reach to, just good guys and bad guys. I mean, the number of times I'm just, talking with my kid and is that person a bad guy? Is that person a good guy? Right. Um, and the idea that people who do something wrong or who cause harm to other people are bad guys and thus no longer part of our shared moral community and people to whom we can do whatever we need to do to protect the rest of us who are good guys is the basic frame and setup of how we think about criminal law and how our penal system works and how it becomes possible to do some really awful things to people. I mean, to entirely remove them from society, to put them in these out of sight institutions that, by the way, there's no freedom of press or access to. So they become these, black boxes within which government can do all sorts of harmful things to people because they are removed not only from the gaze of our press institutions, but from our shared sense of political community. Um, you can do that if you massively individualize crime and just sort of and totalize it. Treat it as people who commit crimes do it because they want to and are therefore bad people. When we know that it's such a more complicated and structural story, right? You can see how crime is impacted by social policies. You can see how if you have communities that are segregated or underinvested in, they have more crime. That's not accidental. Now, the goal of inquest is to write from within the perspective of people who understand where crime comes from, the harm it causes in the communities in which it is most prevalent, and who understand how prisons are also causing harm. That we are trying to combat the harms of crime with harms of prison that actually are creating this vicious cycle and feedback loop that rests on the backs of precisely the same communities that are the sort of, subjects of this organized dissipation, or this organized abandonment. One of the things I love so much about Inquest is that it braids together so many different voices. We publish 2 essays a week. They're about 2,000 words each. Anyone who is listening and who has not already heard of us or is not subscribing, I totally encourage them. It's just inquest.org. You get a newsletter every Saturday morning that describes the 2 essays that we publish that week. And over the span of a month, you'll see essays written by a public defender who ran for office to become a judge and what it's like being a judge with the background of being a public defender. You'll read an essay by someone who is a physician working inside of a prison, treating an aging population and making all sorts of, insightful observations about like what it means to have an incarceration system that's incarcerating the elderly. You'll read about 30% of our authors are writing from inside of prison. They're incarcerated authors, writing about either organizing that they're doing, about things they're experiencing. And then you'll read philosophers, you'll read historians, you'll read sociologists, you'll read poets. Every year for Poetry Month, we have a whole poetry series where our incarcerated authors are recording their poetry over the prison phone lines and reading them on our site. It has become this quilt of a really beautiful community of folks, all of whom deeply understand mass incarceration in one way, either as a doctor, as a lawyer, as a judge, as an incarcerated person, as an organizer, as an activist, as an artist, and who are learning about it from reading about all these other people who understand it in their own way, but who come together with a shared sense of like, this is something that has to end. It shouldn't exist. And let's try to figure out through this shared decarceral brainstorm what alternatives might look like.
Yeah, and I love that. I mean, going back to the kid thing, it, requires imagination to consider these things that are outside of the of our rather polluted water, to continue that metaphor. And I with the time we have left, I do want to dig into some connections here because, you've been mentioning organized abandonment a lot. And I was just recently looking at updates from No Más Muertes, No More Deaths, which is an organization that works in the borderlands to try and leave supplies out for refugees and migrants who come through these borderlands. And oftentimes these supplies are destroyed and or stolen by the Border Patrol so as to make crossings even more deadly. And I feel that, the rippling out of this organized abandonment, right? Like I usually say that, the U.S. empire's violence is not something that is just aimed outward. It is, of course, something that is aimed inward because nobody acts like, Rambo when they're away from home and acts like Mr. Rogers when they're home. And so I'm wondering, we're recording this again on July 8th, Tuesday, July 8th. And the concentration camp, aka detention center known as Alligator Alcatraz, has recently opened down in Florida. And people tend to think, and this is purposeful again, the propagandization, think of these as two distinct entities, right? And yet the interests that drive mass incarceration and so-called detention of migrants are very much intertwined. And I was wondering if you could talk about the legal systems that drive the mass incarceration in both instances. And this paradigm of the US legal system that kind of like, a hammer sees every problem as a nail, and a society whose answer to every perceived problem is to put people behind bars.
Yeah, no, it's a really important point. There's a sort of wonky-ish phrase that gets thrown around, at least in my sort of academic circles and in the organizing circles that I'm in, of carceral logics, which is really just a way of describing a way of thinking about problems that gravitates towards a kind of top-down control system that relies on sort of constricting people's freedoms and their movements and their ability to be part of the broader polity and the broader community. And of course, every society has some form of incarceration, right? They have, every modern society today has some form of jails or prisons. But the sort of sweep of that mindset, the extent to which you reach for that as a first set of solutions, as opposed to thinking of it as the worst case solution, right? There's this famous philosopher in criminal law, his name's Jeremy Bentham, who describes, he has this powerful phrase where he says, all punishment is evil, by which he just means every time you are resorting to this form of state policy, sort of coercive incarceration or punishment, you're causing harm. This is not like, there's a big difference between a prison and a school, right? Every time you build a school, you are spreading something positive. You're generating knowledge, you're creating spaces for people to grow and learn. Every time you build a prison, you are doing something harmful. Now, there's a whole set of arguments people can have over whether you need to do it for some sort of greater good or some greater set of benefits. You have to understand from the starting point, it is harmful when you do it. It's like, chemo for cancer. Nobody just like wakes up in the morning and says, oh, I think I'll have some chemo, right? Like it is poisonous. And so the challenge we have is that we tend to think of it as a first best solution all the time. We have a cascading set of carceral logics, and your point about immigration really captures this. And we see that in the broad use of detention, and carceral logics can lead to things like, we all remember like family separation, right? Like, oh well, we just need to incarcerate the parents and take them away from their children so that we can deter people from coming. Like, again, not dealing with root causes of why people might be fleeing their countries and putting themselves in real peril in order to come here. Of course, immigration is different from penal system incarceration because as few rights as you have in the traditional penal system, again, because of plea bargaining, because you're pressured to waive them all away, you have even fewer legal rights when you are not a citizen. And we are seeing that really underscored now in this second Trump administration, which thinks of non-citizens as basically having zero rights and goes so far as even to, try to strip green card holders of their rights if they, dare to protest against the government or dare to write op-eds in their student newspaper, as happened to Rameza Ozturk, just a few miles from where I'm sitting. And then, of course, that cascades all the way down to folks who have even less legal status than green card holders or visa holders, who are treated as essentially, rightsless people by our current government, and who are then swept into those same systems of carceral control that cause real harm. They cause real harm to the communities where those folks live. They cause harm to their families. They cause harm to the people who are directly being impacted by it. And it just goes to show you that you're exactly right. Once you have a country that is the world's leader in incarcerating its own people, it starts to become something that metastasizes throughout your country. It starts to become a way that you think about your schools and your education. Oh, this person's like, acting out in this school. And, instead of like, let's try to figure out how to solve that, like what's going on with this student, what's going on at home, what are the issues? You have, a whole bunch of school districts that are like, well, let's call the school resource officer to deal with it. Let's have, policing become part of discipline earlier and earlier in life in more and more areas. You have public housing setups where police officers embedded in public housing to deal with residential disputes that immediately then become police adjacent or then criminalized, directly criminalized, and again, feeding into the whole system. We have to find ways to remember that a huge part of antisocial behavior is a product of social policy itself. That's not to say people don't make choices, people don't sort of have, individual free will or no responsibility. I mean, even, like out and out sort of leftist critiques of the penal system still recognize that accountability is important. You have to be able to find ways to talk to each other and acknowledge when someone harms someone and try to figure out why did you do that and how can we have some accountability and some repair. But that's really different than just assuming that everything that everyone does wrong is their own, solely their own fault, has nothing to do with their environment, has nothing to do with the social policies that structured that environment, and is grounds to then treat them as a bad guy to whom you can do bad things.
Yeah, absolutely. The dehumanizing. And, to echo what folks have said in the past, when you dehumanize someone, you also dehumanize yourself. So, what are we creating as a society that creates so much dehumanization of people through the carceral system? It necessarily dehumanizes us as well. And
I
I
mean,
don't,
when you were talking about, I forget the second part of the metaphor you used, but no one's Mr. Rambo out there and Mr. Rogers at home or something like that. It reminded me so much of so our Institute to End Mass Incarceration is deeply engaged in this coalition of folks who are trying to prevent a prison from being built in Eastern Kentucky. That would be the most expensive federal prison ever built. We've been engaged in that fight for 2 years now. Um, and one of the arguments that's always put forward on the pro-prison side is, oh, these are important jobs. We need to bring these jobs into this region. This is a region that's suffering from the loss of the collapse of the coal industry. These are, this is a way to bring jobs. And even there, I have to pause and ask, like, why are these the only jobs on offer? Forget that, like, these are jobs that are basically built on some real human pain and suffering, right? Jobs that are built on incarcerating folks who, by the way, are going to be sent to this prison from places like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., 400 miles away. I mean, this is like exile, and is cutting people off from the family support networks that would actually allow them to start having repair and to and rehabilitation. But just focusing narrowly on the jobs issue, these are awful jobs. I mean, the suicide rates among prison guards are higher than in the rest of the population. Alcoholism rates higher. Domestic violence rates at home, prison guards vis-a-vis their partners. Drug abuse, mental health problems. Why? Because as you say, when you put people into institutions that are deeply violent and broken and dysfunctional institutions of harm and of dehumanization, that is obviously harmful for the people on the receiving end of that system. But it's also deeply corrosive to the mental health of the people on the executing end. And I think one of the important breakthroughs that is necessary for the movement to end mass incarceration is finding ways to better engage with prison guards around the fact that this system is harmful to prison guards in addition to being harmful to prisoners. And it's complicated, right? Like these are jobs, these are livelihoods. But we have to at least be able to speak openly about the fact that these are toxic jobs. And if this is the economic, salvation you're offering a community that's suffering from the loss of coal jobs and offering them poisonous jobs in prisons, it's just another example of the point I've been hammering home, which is we need to find ways to actually put public dollars into making communities healthy and safe and secure and not offering, good jobs, quote unquote, good jobs that are just tied to the whole sort of carceral logics we've been talking about and that are themselves toxic and harmful to us.
yeah, totally. I mean, it reminds me, I have a documentary about West Virginia, and I spoke to several coal miners, and not one of them said that they wanted to die of black lung. But when your options are to work in coal or at Walmart, and you get paid significantly more in coal, you're going to choose that because that's the only choice. And again, it shows a total lack of imagination inside the system because really, you could give somebody a job planting trees. you could give somebody a job. We do have people that have jobs just playing with kids. It's like the idea that we can only have a job in a certain area that is horrifically toxic, either for people's souls or for the environment, shows a complete lack of systemic imagination. And so, yeah, it is very important to see the ripple effects again of the incarceration system. Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us and dive into this. Where is a good place for people to follow your work or to learn more about some of the topics that we've discussed today?
Thanks so much. So our institute is endmassincarceration.org. You can read about our work there. You can also support us. We are a nonprofit, and to pay our lawyers and to do our work, we really need support from the whole community. So there's ways to both read about our work and to donate or to become a repeat supporter of our work. And our magazine is inquest.org. That's inquest, INQUEST.org. And again, you can subscribe there. You can support our work. Again, we depend on donations to be able to pay all of our authors. But there's also a way to subscribe and get our newsletter. And I think that if you are even remotely interested in these topics, becoming a subscriber of Inquest is a way to really read the most cutting edge and insightful voices from folks all across the country and the world who think about our prison system, who recognize it as a monumental social injustice, and who are doing the thinking and the work of trying to figure out the creative, imaginative ways of having a freer, safer, and healthier world.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Really appreciate you taking the time. Folks, check out the links that Andrew just mentioned. And yeah, thank you again.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.